This week on the Chronicles, we will be discussing Japan, the Toothless Tiger by Declan Hayes. The book tackles the current situation in Japan and their relationship with an increasingly powerful China. The author assesses the ability of Japan to cope with such a huge Chinese military power, as well as a weakening American presence in the Asia-Pacific region. The book also highlights the security dilemmas facing Japan and whether or not the country should rearm and become nuclear. These are just a select few of the strategic questions Declan poses in the book, and he demonstrates why Japan must develop a more sophisticated approach in dealing with China, Russia, and the two Koreas, as well as addressing threats to their own security and internal challenges. We spoke with Issa Shaer, an academic with experience working in Japanese institutes, to give us his analysis and opinion on the book and the wider issues facing Japan today.
When you see a society like the Japanese, which are clearly technologically very competent, but socially and culturally seem, as you say, obsessed with timekeeping, very formal, how does that adjust to the modern world where everybody seems to be charging around at a great pace? I mean, can this sort of more ancient attitude to living a lifestyle compete with this modern robotic lifestyle?
I felt rather surprised by the way they were enclosed on each other's. As a society,
it is an insular society in many ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think they're not outward looking, they're inward looking. I was surprised by some of the comments. We were told we went there to help and support the fritters. The fritters are unemployed or drop out from universities who doesn't have jobs, or unemployed individuals, not housewives, but young females and males. And we were looking at maybe they have to encourage the society. They do not promote themselves well. That's the way I saw it. They really do not sell their country, their culture well. They do sell their technology well, absolutely. And that's mainly probably because there is a lot of foreign hands who help them to sell this technology. This technology is needed by the rest of the world, but they have not. The only way they've sold it is mainly because they have individuals from around the world working with them on the promotion, on the selling factor, on the impact.
I think your view on that is probably not that far from what Declan is saying in his book, which is that in his opinion anyway, but I think most people with an experience of Japan who are not Japanese would share that view, that they do have difficulty communicating a view to the outside world. It's not that they're unpleasant people, but they don't like demonstrating interest, affection, whatever. It's just not the done thing. So as a result of that, their diplomatic relations tend to not be very good or very effective. And if you look at their regional relationships, they're a mess.
They really have to sell their country, their achievements, their links, their heritage diplomatically. And through their policies, I think they are very, very weak in that. Their links, it comes across in the book, their links with their neighbors is very weak.
To give us an insight into his book, why he wrote it, and his experiences in Japan, Declan Hayes offers his expert critical analysis in which he highlights the negatives as well as lauding the positive aspects of Japan's place in the world. He explains why he measures Japan's success and failures through an economic lens.
Professor Hayes, thank you for joining us on the Chronicles, and for the benefit of our viewers, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, as you can hear from the accent, I come from Ireland, but I've spent a lot of time outside Ireland, in Mexico, Australia, now England, but 10 very happy years in Japan.
As a society, there you were living as an Irishman amongst 127 million Japanese. How did you find it? Was it a weird experience?
Unlike other Westerners, I wasn't entranced or enthralled by it. I look at Japan and everywhere else, if you like, through cold economic lenses. And I think that can be a very important way to look at it. Other people get lost in the beauty, the pageantry, kabuki and so on. I just look at the harsh economics, because it's from the economics that all that culture comes from.
During the 70s and the 80s, everybody wanted Japanese everything. You know, they did the best of everything. They were unstoppable. And then it all went horribly wrong. Why did it go so horribly wrong for them?
Well, I did write an earlier book on this, Japan's Big Bang. Essentially in Japan, you had 100 yen companies and 200 yen companies. The 100 yen company are among the best companies in the world, household names like the likes of Toyota and Canon. I leave Sony out of it. The 200 yen companies, even if it's 200 yen for $1, they cannot compete. They're no good. So you have these small number of very successful export-oriented companies really dragging the rest behind them. And a bubble built up because in Japan, money in Japan was like wool in Australia. The Australians have the wool, but Italy has Armani. And similarly with money, the Japanese can only do very basic things with it. So in some ways they're very efficient, but in many other ways they're very inefficient.
Developing his points further, Declan explains why the Japanese economy has faltered in recent times, pointing the finger at what he calls Japan's artificial economy, based on the tactics of a powerful United States. He also emphasizes the territorial challenges Japan has faced, particularly with China.
There it is, a phenomenally big society, highly educated, second best education in the records, and yet it does seem in a state of turmoil. I mean, their national debt is 200% their GDP, and their government spends much more than it raises in tax. I mean, how come such an intelligent, highly motivated people are getting this all so wrong? Where's the logjam for them?
Well, the national debt is largely a domestic debt, so it's not the problem, say, Belgium or other European countries would have. Now, Japan economically is very artificial. It lost World War II, and it was essentially made in the image the USA wanted it to be made. So in some things, cars in particular, certain electronics, they're the best in the world. They're very efficient at making those things, but they're trying to carry everybody else. So Japan had an economic model that was very successful from 1947 to 1988.
And it's also geographically, of course, in what's becoming a fairly volatile part of the world, because obviously China has grown exponentially. I mean, I think the Chinese economy probably has its own problems coming down the track, but it's still a great roaring beast of a neighbor to have. And you've got Korea, North Korea particularly, it must be a worry for them. You've got the influence of the South China Seas. Does the Japanese citizen feel as if it's all starting to hem in on them a bit?
Well, the traditional enemy for Japan was Russia to the north.
Yeah.
There are still big territorial disputes there. Now, China has copied Japan's industrial model, but on a gargantuan scale. And just as Japan had to expand in the 1920s and 1930s to keep its own artificial economy going, so has China to do that today. And China has to pick its enemies, and the two most obvious enemies are the USA, which can always bring its fleet back to Hawaii, or Japan. So Japan is stuck with its neighbours, and it has very volatile neighbours.
Is the position with Russia now more sympathetic towards Japan's position because they're worried about China too, or is it my enemy's enemy's my friend all over again?
Well, Russia, as we can see in Ukraine and so on, has plenty of problems itself. It does have a major territorial dispute with Japan in Sakhalin that I think can be resolved the Soviet Union grabbed that at the end of World War II, and they need the money from Japan to finance it. So I think that can be worked out. But if Japan starts doing military treaties with Russia, Vietnam, India, etc., I think China will have something to say about that, and it won't be very, very pleasant.
Issa Shah concludes his analysis of the book by describing the innovative nature of the Japanese people and their ability to travel the world, pick up ideas, and utilize them to the benefit of the Japanese people. Issa explains why he's an optimist when it comes to Japan, highlighting their rich heritage, but more importantly, their incredible resilience and the ability to keep going despite the challenges that face them.
Engineering is obviously very important to the Japanese because that's what they built their strengths on, and their engineering capacity and their computing skills. How do they keep that fresh? Do they import a lot of foreign academics to keep the university pool turning over, or in your experience is that quite insular as well, and they only want to make you a professor of your Japanese?
I think to be at senior level and a management level in Japan, you have to be Japanese.
Yeah.
There is no vacancies in that senior positions for foreign entrepreneurs or foreign academics.
So innovation is all homegrown?
Homegrown. A lot of it is homegrown, but they are very good at capturing ideas. They do venture around the world. And a credit to the Japanese society, and I think it was highlighted in the book, their abilities to go around the world, capture information, and come back, and then use that knowledge to produce with high quality of resilience and products that are better than the products they have seen somewhere else.
They have the second highest rate of educational achievement at 16 years of age in the world. And obviously they're third biggest economy. So they've got a lot of pluses in the box, Japan. But there are lots of worries for them as well, because they're in a region which is not that stable politically because of obviously their relationship with China and their relationship with Vietnam and India, and to an extent as well, of course, Russia. Did you find while you were there was a flavour of uncertainty about the future and about their relations with their neighbours?
Expectations, that's now working negatively, unfortunately, in Japan, because students, after they finish their compulsory educations, when they go to the university, if they don't see they are capable of achieving the same high potential their parents see in them, they tend to drop out. Or there's a high suicide rate.
There's a very high suicide rate, isn't there?
Because of fear of failure or not achieving the required standard that has been imposed or been portrayed for them by their family or by the society.
So immense pressure on very young...
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's working negatively.
Issa, one of the things that I'm fascinated by, that it seems to me when you look at the sort of the success of Japan, it was all based on the high level of educational attainment, driven of the university developments. Do you see that as an academic? Is that continuing? Because graduate unemployment seems to be rising in Japan, and yet, as you say, they're very driven. So where's that going for them? Is their format stagnating?
I think at this rate, if Japan carries on, they will lose a lot of their emotion, their drive, of the drive and the emotion of their youngsters. There could be a rebellion from the youngsters, wanting to leave and to go out and venture out in the rest of the world.
So on the whole, you're an optimist about the Japanese, you think? They've still got a lot to contribute to the...
They have a lot to contribute to the world. We have to recognize they have heritage, they have history, they have stamina and ability to keep on going. And even if you close Japan tomorrow, they will keep on going on their own without the rest of the world. But there is the fear of that internal rebellion. You see, sometimes what comes from outside doesn't break you. It's what comes from inside. I hope they could overcome it by 2020. I'm looking forward positively at the Olympics, because I think Japan has been given a lifeline through the Olympics in 2020. If they use it positively, they could overcome quite a lot. If they do not use this opportunity positively and constructively, they could miss the boat.
Developing his points further, Declan outlines the strength of the Japanese Navy as well as their powerful dual technology. Declan conveys his belief that the Japanese have many reasons to be optimistic for the future, at the same time remaining wary of the rapidly growing Chinese economy. Declan also points out the Japanese weakness when it comes to diplomacy, but highlights their effectiveness when it comes to so-called silent diplomacy in international affairs.
Obviously, the title of your book, the clue's in the name, The Toothless Tiger. But what's Japan's answer to that? And obviously, after the defeat in the 1940s and after the nuclear bomb detonations, they became pacifists, as it were, theoretically or constitutionally. They weren't allowed to be involved in foreign wars. That slipped a bit when their American friend said, you must help us in Iraq. How seriously is that now taken in Japan? Do they feel they should be on a world stage now, creating armed forces that can take part in UN missions? And
well, their UN missions have been a bit of a failure because the Japanese would say the Americans have not helped them logistically. Japan in the West is the second biggest military spender after the USA. Japan has a fantastic navy still. In World War II, it gave the two biggest navies, the Royal Navy and the US Navy, a good run for their money. And in the tsunami in Asia, the Japanese were able to launch a blue water navy that China then could not do. It can do it now. Similarly, in the Afghan war, the Japanese Navy has been supplying the USA. So logistically, their navy would give a very good account of themselves. Their army, I think, is problematic. So I don't think, and given their age too, I don't think Japan could fight a land war. But what they do have is they have a lot of technology, and they could become a nuclear power in the blink of an eye. Technology
but is their defense budget
problem.
under pressure? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about the extent of public expenditure being greater than the taxes the government raises, level of public debt and all the rest of it. Many nations faced with that problem, including the United Kingdom, part of the answer is they cut their defense spending. But for the Japanese, that doesn't appear to be a big issue for them.
The Japanese have very good trees of knowledge in battleships and how to reinforce steel. But the Americans either cherry pick them or stop them exporting. They have a couple of Mickey Mouse deals with Romania and so on. The other big thing Japan has, and they're the best in the world at this, is they have dual technology. So all the smart bombs are generally, the brains of the smart bombs are usually made in Japan. Now the problem from a military point of view is the likes of Canon and so on who make them, they don't want the bad publicity that they're making smart bombs to lob on China, because that will affect Canon sales in other areas. So on dual technology, the Japanese are the best. They have trees, but the Americans have the forest, and the Americans control the forest.
So the Toothless Tiger thing, is it psychologically for them that they think their big brother America would actually be the backstop if anything really happened? How reliable an ally would that be if you think 10 years ahead, 15 years ahead?
Well, Japan in World War II fought every country in the world except Thailand, Italy and Germany. Most notably, they fought China, the Soviet Union, Britain and Australia, but only one country, the USA, was allowed to occupy it. And the fallback position in the Korean War for America was Okinawa. And Korea is the only place in the world the Americans have said, yes, we have nuclear weapons here, and yes, we will use them. They've said that about nowhere else in the world. They may have them, they may not have them. Now the question is, can America keep these little tripwires in places like Okinawa and a much bigger tripwire in the Taiwan Straits? And America is stuck for money. China is on the rise, so it has to try to pass some of this down the line. America's post-war strategy in Asia was hub and spokes, whereby America was the hub and Korea, Taiwan and Japan were the spokes. Now, I don't think that can stay the way it is. So I think America will have to come out of the equation, which means somebody or a group of somebodies will have to stand up to the plate. Today, they're quiet in the United Nations, and they are very bad at diplomacy, very bad at publicity. People would argue they do silent diplomacy, and that's much better. But certainly media-wise, they have a lot of enemies.
Declan concludes the interview by highlighting the prospects of future Japanese generations, as well as refining his analysis of the regional politics surrounding Japan and the powerful states at play. Declan also emphasises Japan's strong core industries and the sustainability of these industries for years to come.
So we've got this Japanese society that's sort of feudal but sort of modern. We've got a Japanese economy that shouldn't work but just about hangs on in there. We've got a remarkably astute and well-educated strata of people amongst them. And yet they seem so uncertain about the future. They're unsure whether their own defense forces would be capable of defending them. They must be unsure whether their principal ally, America, would actually come up if they were needed. So life must be very uncertain for them. If you're a young Japanese person, where do you think all this future is going?
Well, I think uncertainty is worldwide. Certainly, people leaving school now anywhere face a more uncertain future than we would have. What with the oil crisis and so on. So it depends which Japanese people you're speaking about. The people at the middle, life will continue to be good for them, but most ordinary young Japanese people can only find part-time work now. Obviously, it's a high-wage society. That's how it was controlled. High wage, high cost. But you have all these strains coming in Japan, and Japan has to find its place in the world, and it hasn't found its place.
But is there a general will to have politicians who are saying unpalatable things to the Japanese voter, or is part of the difficulty Japan has that their system just perpetuates people who tell you what you want to hear?
Today, there is no great future for a lot of young Japanese people because they cannot compete on price, they cannot compete on anything. The core thing, the core Japanese industries are very strong and very, very good. Now, the change is a very gradual change, but the Japanese are bad at reacting with the outside world, and particularly bad with its neighbours. Their challenge, and it's a big one, is to get a new model working with its neighbours and coming to some kind of an accommodation with the huge neighbour across the sea, which is China.
And one of the quotes you have in your book, which made me chuckle, is that strong fences make good neighbours.
Yeah.
I mean, are they going to build a strong fence, the Japanese? Well, are they going to swing from being not really terribly interested in having a strong military base to saying, whether we want or not, we've got to have one?
Well, they are making their navy stronger, they're making their air force stronger, so if there is a war, Japan will give a very good defensive account of itself, but I would not like to be in the neighbourhood or have property in the neighbourhood because it'll be a high-tech, very explosive war.
Professor Hayes, it's been fascinating.
Okay.
I think the issues you cover in your book, I'm sure, are going to become vitally important to us all, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with the Chronicles.
Okay, thanks very much for having me.